Hey, what's up guys? Parker Walbeck here with FullTimeFilmmaker.com. Now, I recently just got back from some awesome trips to Thailand, Japan, Hawaii, and posted travel videos about each, and I've been getting a lot of questions about my process for planning, shooting, and editing these types of travel videos. So in this video, I'm going to be going over my top 10 tips to improving your travel videos. But this is a loaded topic. There's a lot of content to cover, so this video is going to be part 1 of 3. Parts 2 and 3 will be in the course at FullTimeFilmmaker.com, and they'll also be available in a new mini course I put together that focuses just on travel videos, and we'll talk more about that at the end. But let's go ahead and dive into my top 10 tips for better travel videos. Tip number 1 is plan ahead. Now, I know that sounds like a no-brainer, but creating a detailed itinerary is something that most people don't do very well. And I'm not just talking about deciding on one activity that you're going to do each day. I mean schedule out every single hour of every single day. Let me give you an example. Here's a look at one of my days I scheduled for our Thailand trip. And every single day of our 15-day trip looked just like that, jam-packed with an hour-by-hour rundown of what I hope to accomplish that day. Before your trip begins, go research online, Google top things to do in Thailand, read several articles from different people's perspectives on what the must-see attractions are, and then start making a list of what you want to see. Check and see if they have restrictions on filming in any of those locations, then schedule out the most time-efficient way to see all those places in the least amount of time and put together an itinerary to do so. Now, quick tip during this part is to contact or hire a local of that country to help you know what to see and help you get around once you're there. In this case, I was hired to film a wedding for a YouTuber named My Mate Nate that lived in Thailand. So I told him that I'd film his wedding in exchange for an all-expense trip paid for me and my family to Thailand. So Nate was a huge part in helping me decide which activities would be worth my time, which ones would be tourist traps, and some hidden gems that we wouldn't find on any tourist articles. Now, we were in Thailand for about 10 days, and in those 10 days, we took about 10 different plane rides, allowing us to see a wide range of attractions, and we spent about 40 to 50 hours in a van ride. So this is something to keep in mind if you plan on shooting a great travel video, is that you're actually going to be doing a lot of traveling. Half of your trip will be spent in some mode of transportation, because the reality is not all the best attractions are central to one city. They're always spread out over hundreds of miles, so be prepared to jump around. I also made sure to schedule the main attractions during golden hour because I wanted the best possible lighting for the most important images. Now, because this was doubling as a family vacation with my 1-year-old daughter, we had to work around her sleep schedule, so we weren't able to shoot during the best light all the time. But we still woke up at 4 a.m. a lot of times to drive 2 hours to a location so that we could start filming by 6 a.m. sunrise. And we'll talk more about lighting in just a minute. But you get the point. A great travel video starts with a super organized itinerary so you can capture as much content as you possibly can. And this brings me to tip number 2, and that is content is king. I talk about this a lot, but once you've got a stellar plan put together and you've embarked on your trip, now the shooting begins. One of my biggest pieces of advice is to shoot a lot of content. But don't just shoot to shoot. More footage isn't always better unless you're getting good footage. Be intentional about every single shot. Before you roll the camera and waste hard drive space, make sure that what you're capturing will add value to your story and to your edit. I see too many people shooting and including clips into their edit that any random vacationer could have captured. Full of tourists, poor lighting, shaky movement, overexposed, bad composition. Be intentional with every single shot, and we'll talk more about storytelling later. But as a rule of thumb, always shoot more than you think you're gonna need, because you can always edit down what you've shot, but you can't go back and reshoot shots that you wish you would have shot to help fill in your gap in your edits. To give you an idea of how much footage I shot on this Thailand trip, I was there for 10 days, shot over 13 hours of footage, and my final edit was less than 3 minutes. That's less than 1% of my footage making it into the final edit. Give yourself a lot of footage to work with, because what that does is it makes it so that your final video is the cream of the crop, the best of the best. Only the most stunning shots make the final edit. So the more footage you have to work with, the more picky you can be with which shots make your final edit to make it a more engaging video for your audience. This is one of the biggest problems I see in people's travel videos. Most people go to a destination, shoot for a day, capture about 100 clips, and about 80 of those clips show up in their final video that's like 7 minutes long. So instead of picking the best of their footage and presenting it in a well-crafted edit, they're essentially showing you every clip they captured, even the ones that are overexposed, poorly framed, shaky handheld stuff, whatever. Now, unless you're a daily vlogger whose style it is to show every second of your day despite the quality of those clips, I recommend not showing your entire folder of footage, but narrowing it down to the best of the best. And if you only have 1 minute of best clips, then make a 1 minute edit. Instead of a 7-minute edit with 1 minute of best clips, mixed with 2 minutes of average clips and 4 minutes of below average clips. I promise you, out of that 13 hours of footage I shot, there's a lot of garbage, a lot of clips that should never see the light of day. It doesn't matter how good you are at shooting, you're going to end up shooting footage that isn't worth putting in your final edit. So shoot a large quantity of content and then be super picky and only choose your best clips for your final edit. Now this leads me into our next tip, because people often ask me, well, how do you determine which clips are your best and which clips are average or below average? And how do you make sure that while you're shooting clips that are in the best category? So let's now talk about some of my tips for capturing beautiful images. That brings us to tip number 3, and that is composition. Now this is a loaded topic, and I actually have a full video in the course talking about my 10 rules to composition, but I want to touch on a few of those as they apply to shooting travel videos. The first rule I'll touch on is called dominant subject. One of the biggest mistakes I see is people filming a landscape or a group of people, but they don't even know what they're focusing on, let alone what they want the audience to focus on. What is your dominant subject of your frame? And then once you've decided what the dominant subject is, what's in your frame that you could eliminate that is distracting you and your audience from that dominant subject? Remember, it's not just what's in your frame, it's also about what's not in your frame. So be willing to wait a few minutes for a clear shooting path without tourists, or find a different angle to shoot from that will give you a better composed shot, or switch out your lens to a focal length that helps you focus better on your subject. People always ask me, how the heck did you get that shot without any tourists in it? And the answer is, well, I either go early in the morning when nobody else is awake, or I hurry up and wait. Meaning, I'll hurry up and get to a location and then wait, sometimes for a half hour or an hour, for there to be a lull in tourist traffic so that I can hurry up and grab a clean shot with nobody in it. You go as fast as you can to get to the next place, next location, and then you just sit here and wait for tourists to clear. All right, we got one guy left.
It's clear.
And, oh, nope. Taking her jacket off. Now this guy here, see? Right in my shot. That's a big part of shooting travel videos. A lot of people will just come and get a shot with all these tourists in it, and it's just not quite as magical when you got that tall guy in the black sitting there, you know? That's hurry up and wait right there. So we're waiting. It's only been a few minutes, but it'll probably be a few more minutes before I get my one shot, and then we'll move on. Then I finally got a clean shot without tourists. Then I went down to a different angle and found a better spot to get a shot without any tourist signs in the frame. These shots are tough because you can't look at your framing, because I'm watching my feet so I don't fall and die. So you just gotta kind of hope that whatever you're shooting is framed well. So be willing to work hard for a clean shot that has a dominant subject without anything distracting from what you want your viewer to focus on. Another big part of great composition is lens choice or focal length. One of the questions I get asked most is, what lenses do I use on these travel videos? Now it can be tough to haul around a lot of gear, and a lot of times you can only take 1 or 2 lenses with you. So the main 2 lenses I bring is the Canon 16-35 and the Canon 24-70. And for a few of the extra wide shots, I pulled out my 12mm Liowa, and for shots where I couldn't get very close to my subject, like with animals, I pulled out my Canon 70-200. But with travel films like this, my main focus is usually landscapes and people. For landscapes, I usually want a wide angle to capture more of my surroundings, so I'll film a lot of those shots at 16mm. And for people's faces, it's been said that the most flattering focal length to shoot the human face is around 70-100mm. So I like to use my 24-70 for those. That way I can still get pretty wide at 24mm to capture those wide shots, but quickly zoom into 70mm for those tight shots of faces. Now ideally I would be using all prime lenses, but when you're shooting a wide variety of content in a limited amount of time of unpredictable subjects, zoom lenses are just more practical and will allow you to capture more content at a wider variety of focal lengths for more flexibility in the editing room. If I had to break down the percentage of use of each of these lenses on this Thailand video, I'd say that I use the 16-35mm lens for about 40% of the shots, the 24-70 for about 40% of the shots, and the 12mm for about 10%, and the 70-200 for about 10%. And really, I probably could have gotten away with just shooting the whole video with a 16-35 and a 24-70. So don't feel like you have to take a bunch of gear to capture great shots. Also, speaking of gear, I shot 95% of this video on the Red Weapon at 6K for licensing reasons, which I'll talk about later, and about 5% of the footage I shot on the 1DX Mark II during times where I was afraid that the Red would get water damaged or when I was doing time lapses. And about 90% of this video was shot using the GlideCam HD4000, and about 10% of it was just handheld handheld, and then just throwing on some warp stabilizer in post to make those handheld shots look smoother. Now, one more tip about great composition is to look for leading lines or symmetry or anything that creates depth. As I'm walking around a location, I'm scanning for anything beautiful. Landscapes, culture, people, animals, anything that stands out to me as something beautiful and relevant to my story. And a lot of times, I'll start shooting something, and a few seconds in, I'll realize, this doesn't look as good as I thought it would, and so I move on. And it's important to be able to know when to stop shooting and to move on to something new, because you only have so much time in a day, and you have to realize that if you're spending a lot of time shooting this shot, then you're foregoing other shots that could be better than the one you're shooting. And this goes back to planning. Have a list of things you hope to shoot, and look at that list, and if there's something on that list scheduled that you think will be better than the content you're currently shooting, then pass it up and move on to the next location before that sun goes down. And speaking of sun, tip number 4 is lighting. Learning how to work with natural light is a huge part of shooting travel videos because that's usually the only light you have to work with. Like I mentioned earlier, I recommend scheduling your most epic locations around golden hour so you can get that sun low in the sky, giving you prettier lighting. But you want to utilize every hour of the day when you're on these trips, so you have to learn how to shoot in the middle of the day too. For shooting in the middle of the day when lighting isn't great and the colors are bland, I like to use polarizers because polarizers cut out the sun's reflection to help bring out more color and to make it feel like it was better lighting than it really was. Also, be aware that golden hour doesn't always guarantee a better image. It also depends on which direction your camera will be facing during that golden hour. So sometimes, if I'm able to, I'll shoot the same landscape at different times of the day to give me 2 different looks, and then I can decide in the editing room which one turned out better. For example, this was shot during golden hour, but for this particular landscape, shooting this particular direction, it gave me a lot of unwanted shadows and morning haze. So I came back and shot that same shot at noonday, and everything was lit up much better, and the morning haze was completely gone, revealing much better colors in the sky. So again, golden hour isn't always best for every scenario. Weather can also be a big role of shooting travel videos because you're only going to be there for a few days, and you may get super unlucky and go during a really stormy week. Thailand, for example, isn't a very sunny place in general, so I had to deal with a lot of cloud coverage, especially during golden hour, so my best direct sunlight was always coming in the middle of the day, so I rarely had ideal lighting conditions to work with. But as we talk about in the natural lighting video, clouds have their advantages too. They create a soft light that is better for shooting people's faces. So that's why a lot of my best Thailand footage ended up being shots of people's faces because I had so much cloud coverage. And if it is sunny while shooting people's faces, I recommend putting the sun behind them so they're backlit, or find a shaded area so they aren't being hit by any direct sunlight. So again, learning how to utilize natural light will help your images look a lot more cinematic and professional. But even if you do shoot in great lighting, if you don't have your exposure set right or your color balance is off, then it can make that great lighting look bad. Which brings me to tip number 5, and that is camera settings. Another big mistake I see in people's videos in general, and especially in travel videos, that makes their videos look amateur is their images are overexposed or have poor color balance. Learning how to dial in your camera settings is a huge part of creating cinematic, professional looking images. Now, as far as the settings that I used for this Thailand video, most everything was shot at 60 frames per second at 6K resolution on the Red Weapon, and then I slowed down that footage to 24 frames per second in post, giving it that dreamy slow-mo look that I often like using for these types of videos. And because the Red shoots raw, it doesn't really matter what I set my color temperature to because I can change that in post, but I still try and get my color temperature set as accurately as possible in camera. But especially if you're working with a non-raw DSLR camera, you have to make sure you get that color temperature dialed in before you shoot. Now, when shooting in direct sunlight, I'll usually be at around 5600 Kelvin because that's about where the temperature of the sun sits during the middle of the day. And as that sun gets lower in the sky, or you get some cloud coverage, that temperature will change a little bit, so you have to learn how to adjust it throughout the day. And again, I talk more in depth about color temperature in the full course. But point is, pay attention to your colors and check before each shot to make sure your image doesn't look too warm or too cool, and make any necessary adjustments. Now, even if you aren't shooting raw, you can still adjust your color balance in post to a certain degree, but what you can't fix in post is recovering blown out highlights. And again, I see this all the time in DSLR footage. Usually the cheaper your camera is, the worse the dynamic range is going to be. Dynamic range meaning the camera's ability to capture both highlights and shadows. And I've found that it's a lot lot easier to recover crust shadow details than it is to recover blown out highlight detail. So if you're trying to decide what exposure to shoot at and you're not sure exactly how bright your image needs to be, I would recommend erring on the dark side and pulling the shadows up in post instead of erring on the bright side and having to bring the highlights down, because it's a lot harder to recover those blown out highlights. Now obviously if you're shooting directly into the sun is going to be blown out, and that's okay. But generally speaking, try and keep all of your information in the middle of this histogram, and that will ensure a correct exposure. Other camera settings to be aware of: I like to keep my aperture high around 8-22 when I'm shooting landscapes, and I keep it low around 2.8 when I'm shooting tighter shots like people's faces, so I can get that nice shallow depth of field. With the shutter speed, it depends on what my aperture's at and what my lighting is like, but generally I try and keep my shutter speed double my frame rate, but sometimes I'm okay bumping it up a little. But that's it for tip number 5, and this concludes part 1 of this how to shoot a travel video series. Stay tuned for part 2 and part 3, and if you have any further questions, please let me know.